Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me here and thanks for checking out my podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and click the notification bell for new episodes. You can also find Shine Without Shame on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Today, my guest is April Snell. April received her master's degree in peace and conflict studies at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, where she served as its global leadership program coordinator during her graduate studies. She aspires to provide educational, cultural, and professional opportunities that transcend borders to foster a peaceful, interconnected world where all people achieve their full potential and think as global citizens, building inclusive communities. She has volunteered her time teaching English as well as citizenship training and meditation to refugees experiencing PTSD after fleeing war torn countries. April has also served as the executive producer of Air International Flight 103.1 FM, where she created and produced the radio talk show Air International. The aim was to educate listeners about positive, passionate, progressive people in the local and global or glocal community, making a positive impact for the communities they serve while playing traditional and contemporary music from around the world. April to chooses April chooses to continue to live into the quote, once social change begins, you cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate a person who feels pride. And you cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. From Lessons of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., speech by Cesar Chavez, January 12, 1990. April, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Tiffany.
My pleasure. I always like to share with the audience how my guest and I know each other. So let's just chat briefly about how and when we met. It's sort of recent, right?
So, Tiffany and I met through a book study, and it was through Bell Hooks' The Will to Change. And it's a book about um, how this book got into the hands of a young man who was in jail and read it. And it was a book on feminism. And um, he shared it with the rest of the inmates in his cell block and how they gravitated towards this book. But what the book really talks about is how, um, really, how white supremacy, racism, imperialism intersect.
Right. Yes. I think that was in January when that book club started, and you and our friend Chuck are the co-facilitators. And I was excited to join because I a friend sent me the information. I didn't know really I didn't have any context for who was involved and how it got started, so I just showed up. And I enjoyed the experience and the conversations immensely. I mean, it's such a rich topic.
Yeah.
And I've always appreciated what you in particular have to offer. You bring a very soft experience to a very harsh and sometimes painful topic. And your energy, your presence really, I think, makes everyone feel that much more comfortable. I mean, our Chuck, who's the other facilitator, also does a great job, of course, of doing that. But I always am I always feel like you're my big sister when I
Oh,
show up, and I love it. It's been a really powerful experience for me to learn, but also to share some of the things that I've shared about my experience with patriarchy and oppression. So, thank you for continuing to lead us in that journey and process with the book study. So, yeah, so we met this year, but it seems like I don't know, it just seems like right away I felt connected to you, I'm happy that you were willing to do this, and I know that there's a lot that we have to talk about. As you know, my podcast is focused on shame. I really started it so that I could have conversations with all kinds of people on the topic of shame, but my hope is that the podcast promotes the idea of letting in general, letting shame go as a way of holding us back. I really see shame for the most part as a tool that we either use for ourselves or for others, um, that for the most part holds us back. If we sit in shame and we live in shame, and or we have some experiences or some thoughts that we're shameful about, it can be really hard to move forward, to find joy, to find that inner peace, and to operate from our best selves. And so that's why I started the podcast. And I wanted to have opportunities with a variety of people to explore this topic. And what I found interesting when you and I started to explore the possibility of having this conversation is you had a very particular and more recent experience with shame that it looks at shame from a different aspect that I hadn't been considering. And specifically, of course, I'm going to let you share this experience shortly, but you've talked about shame in this one experience being an actual tool to help search for truth, to help search for justice, and
Yes.
that shame in this experience wasn't so much about holding somebody down or keeping them back from feeling good about themselves, but really it was like more of a mirror, I think, to have them look, to reflect to them an area or some areas where maybe they weren't actually shining truth on a situation or allowing truth to fully manifest. So I found that interesting because I haven't actually thought of shame as being something that could be positive. So I would love to now
Mhm.
let you share about this experience and talk about why you chose to use shame in this particular experience and what have been the positive outcomes. Hopefully there have been, but what has that led to in the process? So take us back.
Okay. So let me give you a little background information, your listeners, a little background information. I served on the Graham Historical Museum Advisory Board, um, and I was brought in because I was a Black woman. There were no Black people on the board, and they wanted to have a Black perspective and to also bring in some artifacts from the Black community. Well, Graham, North Carolina, um, back in, say, 1860s and before, um, their main industry was textile industries, and they used free labor, slavery, to build up this community. So a lot of the people in this community have that mindset of um, just a Confederate mindset as to why uh, slavery was beneficial to this area. And there's a strong presence, or at least there was a strong presence of uh, the Klan here, and they are still here. And that's not to say that everybody in this town is racist, but there's a lot of people who still have that mentality. So anyway, um, there we were supposed to vote in whether or not Wyatt Outlaw, who was the first Black magistrate here in North Carolina in 1965, when slavery was supposed to be abolished. And he was made the first Black magistrate, and he was hung basically within the same few days that he was made magistrate. There's a lot of history behind that, but to get to the point, the museum that I was volunteering at, the Holts were they had a big influence on this community. And a lot of their artifacts are within the museum, and the community kind of holds them up because they were the main people who brought jobs to different people in the Graham area because of their textile industry. And anyway, long story short, which I recently found out, Van Buren Holt was one of the men who led the lynch mob to hang and kill uh, Wyatt Outlaw, who was to bring peace between the races. And he was killed. So the museum wanted to commission a piece of artwork to memorialize Wyatt Outlaw in this museum. But when you go into the museum has a lot of the good old boys that are uh, hung into this museum. And when I mean hung, like pictures hung on the wall, artifacts brought in. And I had sat on the board during acquisition to vote things in, and I brought prominent African American people to be put on the walls. And I had been there for almost going on 3 years, and nothing had been put on the walls to show that these people were of color. I was able to bring in a uniform of one of the first Black officers that served in Vietnam. He had a platoon, and they were of Black and white men to see whether or not they would follow his lead. Well, they did follow his lead, and he gave me his uniform, and we put the uniform into the museum, but the photographs of him were not put into the museum. So you couldn't tell that he was a Black man unless you knew him personally. So, and I also brought in Tony Forrest, who was our first Black senator here in North Carolina, as well as a woman, a Dr. Nettie Baldwin, who studies genealogy, and she was an educator by trade. So anyway, none of those people went on the walls. And like I said, I had brought him in almost 3 years ago. So I missed 2 consecutive board meetings, and I was put off the board. I got a letter, but mind you, this woman and I used to have conversations, go to Greasy Spoons and eat breakfast, and went out on field trips and all of those kinds of things. But she sent me an email to let me know this. And the next day, there was going to be a vote on whether or not we should continue along with the Wyatt Outlaw project. I was a no as far as memorializing him at that museum, because I believed that he deserved a better place to be memorialized. However, the genealogy aspect and the oral history project, I would have been a yes for. So anyway, she decided that she was going to put me off the board, which meant that I didn't have a voice or a vote as to how this would proceed, which was she was very proud of, because she has help from a woman at the Smithsonian, which they could have still went on with the genealogy part and the oral history part, which I developed the oral history part and did not have access to edit the way that I wanted to edit. So where there may have been Black lineage from the Holt family, those kinds of things would have been edited out. You see what I'm saying?
Right. Yes.
So anyway, after she sent me the email telling me that she was putting me off the board, that really hit hard, because I knew that there was going to be a vote. And I was the only African American on the board who could give my sentiments. And from talking to the African American community, they didn't really think that that was the proper place for Wyatt Outlaw to be memorialized. So anyway, I ended up writing a letter to her and letting her know that the day that she let me go was the day that Wyatt Outlaw was hung, which was February the 26th.
Oh, wow.
And I CC'd the board to let them know about my sentiments about why Wyatt Outlaw should not be memorialized in the place where the Holts were, where the Holts basically were memorialized. And it was a Holt that led the lynch mob to hang him. So, and I said that we needed to have a day, if there is to be a memorial for Wyatt Outlaw, not only does it not need to be at that museum, it needs to be, the memorializing needs to put, the words need to be put together by a diverse group of people who understand what Wyatt Outlaw was trying to do. So anyway, I don't have the letter in front of me, but basically um, it was in a way to not shame, but to speak truth to power. And speaking the truth, if that shames you, then it shames you. And this issue that we're going on, that's going on now in the United States, as this racism that's coming back up, unfortunately, we have to keep addressing it. And if it seems like shame, then that's what it, if it sticks onto you, then there's a reason why it's sticking.
Mhm.
And it needs to be, we have to keep talking about our past and talking about not only what's happened in the past, but what's happening in the future. I mean, happening now at this time, so that it can have an effect on our future, so that we have a more equal and more equitable future for people of color. So some might say that, my Lord, when are they going to stop talking about this? Which I've heard from some people. When you've got the right to vote, you're in government now, you've got jobs in communications. What do you want? But we just saw how George Floyd had his neck, basically he was suffocated to death. We see so many things like Trayvon Martin, who was going to the store to get some Skittles, and who else knows where to go after that. But we keep seeing these things in the news now that we have these video cameras where we can capture all of these injustices that are being done. So we have to speak out. And if it makes you feel guilty, it makes you feel guilty. Um, and and in hopes that just the social injustice will be taken care of gradually, by not shaming, not guilting, but speaking the truth and having people to open their eyes.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. So, would you say a little bit more about it was a board member or the chair of the board who removed
Yes.
you? Would
Yeah.
you say a little bit more, or maybe I think maybe um if you could reiterate that experience or that situation, if you could just say a little bit more about because I know you started talking about the email, but you weren't, maybe you hadn't landed on the two important points that you were trying to make, but maybe if you could reiterate why you felt you needed to email her and CC the board. What was your intention? What was your hope? What was your objective?
My intention was to bring to light that I was the only African American person on the board. Um, and you had me sit on the board, and to uh, go out and do these oral history projects, and to bring more of an African American influence into the museum. You allowed me to sit at the table, but you didn't take my recommendations. I was allowed and thought I was sitting at a welcome table where I was welcome to the table, but didn't have the same uh, influence that the rest of the board members had, especially after going to just one of, I was invited to a meeting by a friend. And the first meeting that I was there, they were encouraging me to sit on that board. And I was excited about it. But why have me sit there and not have any um, influence as to how African American people were going to be brought in? The people that I brought in were affluent African American people. And I was told, well, we want more of the everyday folks in here. Well, you might have everyday folks in the museum, but the people that I know, they're, to me, they're everyday folks. They might not be everyday folks to you. They may be more affluent than the people that are in the museum. And that's why what I think was, there was a problem there. Um, I was bringing in an educated group of people where I thought they, I was asked to bring in more everyday folks. Let's interview more everyday folks, opposed to the people that I brought in.
Okay. So when you, because when we had this conversation, when you shared this experience with me and I was telling you about my podcast and asking you if you were interested in being a guest on it, you talked about this experience as you shaming someone. And so I just wanted to circle back to that. Do you, and specifically in the email that you sent to the chair
Yes,
and to the
yes,
other board members,
yes.
for you spoke up and essentially said, I wasn't really welcomed. I wasn't really being, I haven't been valued. And I think you said, you pointed out that the day that you were let go was also the day that White Outlaw
Had
was
been hung.
hung. And there was a second point you made that was
Hmm.
like historical significance. I don't know if you recall that, but you you said that your intention was, on one hand, to shame, but to also try to shed more light on the truth and the history. So
Hmm.
do you still, as you're thinking back to that experience and to, the email that you sent to the board, do you feel like you were intentionally shaming, or do you feel like that was just potentially or it was an outcome of speaking up? And
It was an outcome of speaking up. And Tiffany, sometimes um, in the past, I wouldn't take a stand for something that I believed in. Um, I would be more demure in how I would handle a situation. And I find that being demure, sometimes that does not, even if you're speaking the truth, it doesn't, it's not as effective as being very direct and to the point, especially when it's dealing with racism. We've had to kind of gently say things because we don't want to offend. But when you're speaking the truth, if it's truthful and it offends, then it's truthful and it offends. And if it is shaming, then it's shaming. Um, I was angry when I wrote the letter to her. And and then when I sat back and I read the letter, I was like, don't feel bad about what you did. You spoke the truth. Everything you spoke was the truth. So shaming and guilt, there's a passage um by Baha'u'llah, which says, "Noble have I created thee. Why dost thou debase thyself?" And I felt as though that unknowingly or knowingly, that she was debasing herself in order to appease a larger group of people. And I wanted to take a stand of righteous indignation.
Hmm.
And through righteous indignation, that needs to happen sometime, uh, especially when it deals to um, oppressing or silencing a voice. So my intent was not to shame her, but if she was ashamed, then she needs to take a look at herself as to why she is ashamed. And if she feels guilty in doing some self reflection, then guilt and shame can serve to liberating someone
Mm.
if they choose to take a look at that guilt, or if they take if they want to take a look at why are they feeling ashamed, and really do some self-reflection and get to the source of why it is that you feel guilty or ashamed, and then release it, and conduct yourself in such a way that you don't have to experience that again.
Right. Okay. And so, what has been the result of you sending that email, of you shining light on the truth of the situation and how you were treated and how you weren't truly welcomed, and how, you're sharing your feelings and your concerns about the situation? What has been the result?
Well, council members have called me, the city clerk and the uh, a council member has called me or and emailed me, letting me know that my services were appreciated, and the museum falls under the city of Graham. So they the city clerk called and asked what could they do, and whether or not I wanted to continue sitting on the board. And I, you know, no, I wasn't interested in going back to the board. And, my intention is to speak not on a Zoom call, but when I can go in front of town hall, I have that opportunity to speak to uh, at a town hall meeting and let them know why I believe Wyatt Outlaw um, deserves a memorial, not inside of a museum where one of the family members led the lynch mob to hang him, but deserves either the state of North Carolina, the county of North Carolina, or the city of Graham, the county of Alamance County, the city of Graham needs to pay for that memorial. We have a Confederate monument that they've now put this fence around because they're afraid it's going to be pulled down. But yet they can pay for that fence, but they can't pay for a memorial to Wyatt Outlaw. They're protecting a Confederate monument that represents um, the Confederacy and why North Carolina wanted to pull out of the State of the Union, which was to continue to have slaves and have free labor um, build North Carolina, the state of North Carolina. But yet you cannot pay for a memorial for Wyatt Outlaw, who was the first Black magistrate who was to bring peace between Black and white people. And you can't have a memorial for him.
So, are you saying that, the government won't, or is it still a possibility? Is it still on the
There's a
table?
there's a there's a possibility, and it's still on the table.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, there's a possibility. Um, oh,
And your
Tiffany.
your your role in that may, as a citizen, but also as somebody who is a protector of the history and from the Black American perspective, could be and hopefully will be of some influence in that.
Yes, I hope that it will be some influence. The city of Greensboro is suing um, Graham, the city of Graham, um, for that monument being a source of structural violence, structural oppression. Um, so we'll see what happens. There's a lot of groups, Black Lives Matter. The NAACP is wanting to sue uh, the city of Graham. Um, I have an interest. There are many other people, citizens, who have an interest in taking that monument down. But I'm just saying all of that around this Confederate monument and uh, the memorializing of Wyatt Outlaw, there's too much division based on the past. Like in structural violence, you can have a monument that may have served back in, the 1860s, served the state or served the city of Graham, but through time, monuments lose their value. They lose their symbolism. They don't do anymore what they did at one time. At one time, it was like, oh yes, Confederate monument, the Confederacy, yes. But here in North Carolina, in Graham, there are more people against the Confederacy than there are people who are for what the Confederate monument and what the Confederacy stood for.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing this history, because I'm sure many of us don't know it, especially if we haven't studied it or are not from the South. Um, and I think the political part of it, I know you have sort of a as a citizen, you have a role that you're playing because you served on this board and you've been a part of the conversations around honoring this
White
Black
Outlaw.
American white
Mhm.
outlaw who played such a noble role, or at least had the potential of, being a unifier had his life not ended. So I know that there is that part of it, and that's the context. But what I found, to be honest, most interesting about what you've shared is going back to this idea of shame, guilt, and that you, as we've kind of circled back, I think when we first started talking about this, when we were exploring the possibility of having a podcast conversation, um, I think you were framing it as possibly you were shaming this person, this board member. But it's really interesting to hear you process a little bit more and to hear you say that, well, I don't actually think I was shaming them or making them feel guilty. You weren't happy with them, so maybe the truth was coming through a little more sharply
Yeah,
than if the context was different. But you were speaking truth. You were shining a light on the history and of the city, and how you believed that history should not be hidden, and how you
exactly.
want to promote the truth of it and the nobility of those people involved, especially White Outlaw. And so I think that's the part that I find so interesting, because the monuments and the politics of it, that's such a divisive arena. It's so hard, in my opinion, to really quickly, easily see people come together in those atmospheres and to unify. I mean, that to me is such a longer term process. But I think your choice to speak up, to send a letter to the city council that you had been serving on, and to say why this was so significant, why the hiding or the obscuring, or that somehow there's fear around really letting the truth shine through and letting the history speak for itself. There was fear around that. You were shedding light on that. You were calling that out, and therefore you were calling people out who were a part of this museum uh, project. And I think to me that and really you weren't intending to shame, although that may have been the outcome. I think that to me is so significant, and the fact that you you offered this quote, the quote of you said, "Noble have I created thee, yet thou hast to base thyself," which I think you were quoting from the Baha'i writings, but I find that to be powerful. So was that a sentiment or a mantra that you had in the back of your mind while you were in this this situation, trying to clear things up, trying to find some, justice, some sort of respect? How did that quote, if it did, how did that play a part in how you looked at the situation?
First, I'd like to say I did not sit on the board of city council.
Sorry,
I
yes, right.
it was
The
the
museum.
advisory board for the Grand Historical Museum.
Yes.
And unfortunately, Tiffany, at that time, I did not know, noble have I created thee, why hast
Ah,
thou debased thyself? But I did um, know of this. Can I read something to you for your
yes, please.
listeners? This has come from, it's called The Hidden Words of Baha'u'llah. And let me see my glasses. I just got these specs.
They look
Let me
good.
see. Let me see if I can, we'll turn on a light here. I love this here. It says, I've almost committed it to memory. Um, it says the mm, mm, mm. The best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom, if thou desirest me, and neglect it not, that I may confide in thee. By its aid, thou shalt see with thine own eyes, and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge, and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. Ponder this in thy heart, how it behooveth thee to be. Verily, justice is my gift to thee, and the sign of my loving kindness. Set it then before thine eyes. So now I did have the sentiments of that writing within me.
Hmm.
So,
Justice.
mhm,
Searching for justice with your own
yes,
eyes.
yes, and not through the eyes of others. And a lot of people in this community, they're looking through the eyes of others as to what is right and what is wrong. And it's clear as clear can be, as you have on your shirt, 100% human. If you treat someone as if they are 100% human and not trying to create them as an other, or marginalize them, then you'll see that truth is truth.
Mhm.
And you don't have to try and take a watercolor paintbrush. This is how I described it. Why take a watercolor paintbrush to color over history when it is as clear as day that treating someone wrong, getting free labor, and hanging someone because they were speaking or symbolized justice and symbolized what could be between Black and white people at that time. You're trying to put a watercolor paintbrush over it, and we can see right through it. There's no way that you can make it pretty.
Mm-mm. That's a good analogy. It's really useful. Hmm. So, what have you learned from this experience since it sounds like it's in the rearview mirror, at least, your experience with this museum and bringing the history alive through, speaking to community members and those who have memories and connection to the uh, original citizens. What have you learned, or what have you taken from this experience, and how is it changing, or will it change, do you think, the way you are involved
I
in
think
race relations and, unifying community unity? What is it that you want to do now and maybe do differently?
first of all, I want everyone to know that they have a voice and that words have power and words precede manifestation. And that if you are righteous in your belief, it's okay. Um, what was the word I used?
Righteous
Righteous
indignation.
indignation. That is okay. That is okay if it's shedding truth and speaking truth to power. And what I've learned is that sometimes you have to go beyond speaking in a demure and kind kind of way to in order to cradle the feelings of someone else. Sometimes you just have to say just how it is. Um, and if someone is feeling shame or guilt from that, they need to sit in that until they're really ready to take a really good look at why they're feeling that way. Because if they don't, then what they're going to do is make excuses as to why they're being right. They would rather be right than right.
April, as you know, I am going to ask about your favorite or most recommended TV show. So I always ask my guests before we end, which TV show, new or old, do they recommend and why?
Okay. That was difficult for me to answer because I was thinking about, oh, I don't want people to think that I am just watching blah, just yuck, 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 blah, blah, blah type stuff. So I chose three.
Hmm.
My first one, old, Alfred Hitchcock. I
Did he
love
have it?
the hmm?
Oh, go ahead.
I loved the Alfred Hitchcock hour because it's something that you can watch and you don't have to dedicate too much time to. They're about 45 minutes when you watch them on YouTube. So I like them because the plot line is always good. He's sometimes he objectifies women, but at that time between the 40s, 50s, 60s time, he gave women roles where they did have some kind of power, where they had brains, and he also addressed issues like alcoholism. He had his own way of addressing certain problems that were going on at that time, that were controversial at that time. My next one, which is totally brain pudding, is Ozark.
Hmm. I've heard
Have
about
you ever
this.
seen
I
Ozark?
I have not, but I think another guest might have mentioned this
Oh,
as their favorite. It,
Ozark, they have another season that's coming out. Can't wait till it comes out.
what do you like
The
about it?
What I like about it is the twists and turns.
Mm.
It's about this man who is an accountant, and his wife is an aspiring politician, and uh, she chose motherhood over what it is that she really wanted to do. Well, her kids are grown now, and now she's being enticed by the political arena. And
Mm.
her husband was an accountant, and he was sought after. Who he didn't know was a cartel member, the big kingpin. And he ends up working for him unknowingly, that he was working for the head honcho, and then how he's being drawn into this life where he has to launder money.
Mm.
And they do it through, I think it's through a motel, or where you bring your family to for summer vacations. And
Resort.
resort, yes, but a very homey kind of resort.
Mm.
So it's just the twists and turns
Hmm.
of this little place called Ozark. And my
Oh.
last one is um, the 13th, which I
Mm.
originally watched just not too long ago. I didn't know it came out in 2016, but it talks about how um, free labor has been perpetuated legally through a loophole in the Constitution, which was the 13th Amendment, that no one should be enslaved or to work against their will. And the loophole was unless they are incarcerated.
Right.
So it shows how that loophole has been used to um, have free labor, or basically almost free labor done. Not just one times it was making license plates, but
Mhm.
now people are making things like that go on to satellites, uh,
Hmm.
making things for these large corporations who are getting basically almost free labor. But it started from slavery, then went to Jim Crow, then it went to leasing slave labor, or imprisoned labor out to these different um, business moguls and corporations, and using them for industrial purposes. And how the pipeline from high school into prison, how that happened with basically, for a lot of Black men, marijuana, and the
Right.
three strikes you're out rule, which has people in prison for basically life.
Mhm.
If I'm not mistaken, the three strike rule means you're at least you're in prison for a
Long time.
long
Right.
time. And corporations are using that labor. That's why there's so many prisons out there now. But anyway, if you get a chance to watch it, it's called The 13th, and it'll give you a good understanding of what systemic racism, systemic oppression um, is, and what structural violence is.
Okay. Thanks for those recommendations. And I didn't realize, maybe I did, but I hadn't thought about it, that Alfred Hitchcock had a TV show. I think I heard that or learned about that a long time ago, but I don't think I've ever watched it. I wonder if I can
Oh,
find that.
do you like Alfred Hitchcock?
I do.
Oh, you're gonna love it. Just go to YouTube and type in the Alfred
Mm.
Hitchcock Hour, and there's so many. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Twilight Zone, One Step Beyond.
I love the Twilight Zone. I used to watch that with my dad. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
April, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you sharing about your experiences and your insights and your search for truth and for honoring the nobility in people. Thank you for being you.
Thank you for having me on. I enjoyed it.